We are live.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of our Spark workshop. This is the first session that we're convening for the day, and the speaker of this session needs no introduction to all of you. He is one of the organizers of this workshop. I'm delighted to introduce my colleague from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Jodhpur, Dr. Parichay Patra. He's an assistant professor at the department. He received his doctoral degree in Film and Screen Studies from Monash University, Australia, after which he has worked also as an assistant professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at BITS Pinani, the Goa campus. He has also been a visiting researcher at the Universidad de Buenos Aires in Argentina. And without saying much more, I'm very happy to hand over the reins to him, and I'm looking forward to a very, very fruitful session this morning.
Thanks, Kaamya, for those kind words of introduction. Let me make this solo layout. Yeah, thank you all. And I'd like to thank our chair, Dr. Kaamya, for being here and introducing me to the audience. And I'd also like to thank all of you who are here in front of your screens. Now, we were supposed to organize a talk with a guest speaker in this slot, but that didn't happen due to unavoidable circumstances. So, and that gave me an opportunity to share some of my recent thoughts with you. I don't have a written paper as such, but this is something that I wanted to write on for quite some time. And it's a strange coincidence, perhaps, that this is the World Theatre Day, as you know. Today is the World Theatre Day. And I'll talk mostly about Mohan Rakesh and his theatre and its adaptation by Manipur. But I'll come to that at some later point. Allow me to start talking about the very title that we have for today's paper, In Defense of Not So Political Cinema. I have a few points, and I'm not really interested in presenting a very specific central argument. Instead, I'd like to share my points and ideas with you. And if time permits, I'll show you a few clips. Now, political cinema, it's more like an ambiguous term in cinema studies. It reminds me of something like a displacement. So Paul Williman, the British film and cultural theorist, once talked about something called displacement in cinema studies. There are many concepts that get displaced throughout the history of cinema studies. Perhaps political cinema is something like that. Williman didn't talk specifically about this, but I'm just borrowing that concept from Williman. And I'm also thinking about something called ambiguity, because political cinema is a very ambiguous term. There's a very recent book by Hoylun Law called The Concept of Ambiguity in Film Criticism, or Ambiguity in Film Criticism, something of that sort. I can't recall the exact title. Sorry. Which is about the ambiguous. And there might be many modes of ambiguous in cinema, in cinematic text, in specific concepts that are prevalent in cinema studies, and also in film criticism. So different films pose the idea of ambiguity in different ways. But for a film critic, ambiguity may have some aesthetic reason specifically, as he argues. For me, political cinema is one such displacement and one such ambiguous concept that I'd like to focus on in this talk. Now, since we are concerned mostly with the 1970s, of course, we are concerned mostly with the long 1970s, to borrow the term from many scholars. So yesterday, Kaushik Bhomik was talking about the long 1970s. And there's a very specific, well-grounded way of looking at political cinema within that time frame. When we talk about the long 1960s in the global scenario or the long 1970s in India, we are reminded of specific directly political works in the context of cinema, manifestos, musings, theoretical grounding in this zone rather. So we talk about Fernando Solanas and Octavio Vetino's um, works on third cinema, Hacia un tercer cine, or towards the third cinema, that was published in late 1960s, and they kept on revisiting their standpoints, revising the arguments, coming up with a book called Cine, Cultura y Descolonización, or Cinema, Culture and Decolonization. And many third cinema conferences happened at that time throughout the late 60s, early 70s, in different parts of the global south and also in the global north, in Algeria, in Argentina, also in Canada. Even though there is a non-presence of Asia in such conferences. So there was a very specific way of looking at political cinema abroad. And here, in India, Mrinal Sen and Arun Kaul came up with a manifesto called NCM in short form, so New Cinema Manifesto, which talks about the many modalities of political cinema or mode of political filmmaking and different patterns of production, distribution, and exhibition, engagement with student politics, sorry, and also their indebtedness to French and American avant-garde filmmakers of their time. Now, there is a very substantial film society literature that exists on political cinema and can be unearthed from that period. So I'm reminded of a very recent article published in 2020 by Moinat Vishwas. It's titled Film Revolution Politics, Criticism in the 70s. And it talks about several political strands of the time. New Indian cinema, of course, May 1968 movement and its global repercussions, its aftermath. Indian political movements, Maoism, Naxalism, Brechtian influence on independent theatre, also known as group theatre, independent little magazine publications that were politically very significant, and of course film society discourse in the domain of politics and political cinema. So there were many film society magazines in Bengali, also in Malayalam, of course. Film society movement was very prevalent in these two locations, Bengal and Kerala. So you have magazines like Chitrapot, Chitrabhash, Chitravikhon, Chitrakalpo, or in English, Movie Montage, and more avant-garde magazines like Frontier, where you have a specific body of literature that shapes the Marxist film society discourse on political cinema, and it concerns itself mostly with Engels, Plekhanov, Lenin, Christopher Caldwell, Ralph Fox, Mao Zedong, with European art cinema and Indian political cinema, the works of Mrinal Sen, for instance. But, as Vishwas argues in his article, the film society debates, film society literature that we can access, they do not really engage with the more avant-garde, formally experimental version of the New Indian cinema, the works of Mani Kaul and Kumar Shah. More formal transformation in political art remains largely overlooked in the then film society literature. The kind of formal transformations that can be located in experimental, quote-unquote experimental cinema and visual art of the time, in the works of, say, Badal Sharma's theatre, or in the works of artists such as Bhivan Sundaram and Somnath Hore and K.G. Subramanian, Ashish Rajadhaksha, also talks about this formal transformation in his Indian cinema at the time of celluloid. Now, back then, for the filmmakers who were politically very active, for them, theatre was an intuitive choice within quotes. I'm quoting from Bishash. Because the filmmakers wanted to respond to, and I quote, the orchestrated violence, nightmare, and fantasy, unquote. And for that, the 1970s filmmakers engaged actively with Indian theatre of the long 1960s. So, as you know, Girish Karnad got directly involved in new Kannada cinema. Vijay Tendulkar wrote screenplays. Mohan Rakesh's works were adapted by Manikal. I'll come to that later. Some of Mahesh Elkunchwar's plays like Party and Holi were adapted by filmmakers, middle cinema filmmakers like Govind Nihalni and Ketan Mehta. Sorry. So there's this more obvious association between cinema and theatre, politically upfront vocal cinema and politically, culturally, often sexually subversive theatre of Vijay Tendulkar and Mahesh Elkunchwar that we can find from the 1970s. But I'm not interested in that upfrontness. Instead, I want to talk about something that is not apparently, decidedly political. Sorry. So, in the 1970s, you can find many modes of cinepolitical or cinematic political thinking, to be honest, in the domain of political theory, political philosophy, the works of major political scientists of the time. Uh, so I was just going through an article by David Panagia on Stanley Cavell, and it mentions how in the early 1970s, actually in the year 1970, a very significant year, you have major publications in the domain of political theory. The works of John Rawls, A Theory of Justice, Hannah Arendt, who published lectures on Kant's political philosophy in 1970, but also a year later, Stanley Cavell, the American philosopher who worked extensively on film and philosophy, published his iconic work, The World Viewed, which is important for his insistence on a cinematic political thinking that is extended beyond the idea of representation of politics. And later, many American political theorists, political scientists, philosophers who worked in this domain, the idea of cinematic political thinking, were inspired by Stanley Cavell and his works from the 1970s. So there are many modes of that cinematic political thinking. For instance, in the works of William Connolly and Michael Shapiro and Joshua Foa Dienstag, they talked about neuropolitics or human cognition and politics, geopolitics, and of course, cinema and democracy. The idea of representation in cinema and the idea of representation in a very different sense in electoral democracy and politics. What cinema shares with politics, those domains. So there's a very interesting work by Joshua Foa Dienstag that talks about cinematic pessimism and the idea of representation. So what I want to suggest here is there are many modes of cinematic political thinking. If we can travel beyond the immediate, beyond the domain of mere literal representation of political movements in cinema. I want to quote David Panagia on Stanley Cavell. It's a very interesting, brief quote that may help me with my way of explaining avant-garde cinema. And I quote, I want to claim further that the world made thinkable by a cinematic mode of political reflection takes as a remarkable fact the transformative ontological possibilities of a medium. Transformative, that is, of our aesthetic and political experiences. Unquote. What kind of a transformation these political scientists are talking about? What is this transformative in our cine-aesthetic, cine-political experience? Very recently, I wrote on Kumar Shahani's Tarang that was published in a Bloomsbury book called Populism and Its Limits. So in Kumar Shahani's Tarang, I was talking about, because it's a film made in 1984, after the Indian emergency, and it engages with radical trade unionism and labor unrest in Bombay, sorry, and Indira Gandhi's 20-point program and the violence associated with emergency and its politics, its immediate manifestation, immediate political manifestation. But what happens in Shahani's film is, all of a sudden, that more immediate political situation dissolves into the mythological. So once I interviewed Kumar Shahani over the phone, and he said that in that interview, that telephone conversation, he said that his politics is Koshambian after his mentor, Marxist historian and anthropologist D.D. Kosambi, Damodar Dharmanand Kosambi, who read Indian mythologies into the contemporary. That's what Shahani did in his post-emergency cinema, where all of a sudden he inserts mythological figures. And the way Kosambi came up with a Marxist interpretation of Indian myths in his cinema. So that might be one of the ways of engaging with politics and then organizing the transformative that I was talking about, quoting from David Banerjee. The immediacy of the political experience transformed into the aesthetic experience of a different kind. And you cannot connect the two that easily. Now, in this context, I would focus on Moneykal and a film that he made 4 years before the emergency was declared, because as a film historian, somehow I'm dangerously attracted to the idea of counterfactual history. What is counterfactual history? Something that didn't happen at all. What would have happened if that happened? For instance, I'm reminded of Call's engagement, persistent engagement with film philosophy, with Gilles Deleuze, the French philosopher, extremely important in the domain of cinema studies for his two cinema books, Cinema 1, The Movement Image, and Cinema 2, The Time Image. Call read Deleuze very extensively, and there's very clear reflection of Deleuze in his own writings, own aphoristic writings and other forms of writings. So I was going through an unpublished work by Moinak Vishwas on Call and Deleuze. And there I can find how both Call and Deleuze opposed the idea of cinema as mere language, while elements of cinema, or whether elements of cinema cannot be compared to elements of language, utterances, why cinema might be anti-representational. Because Call and Shahani as well talk extensively about anti-representational cinema in their respective careers and went against the idea of convergence in art and the European perspective painting, the realist mode that was imposed by the expansion of the European ideas of the Renaissance perspective during the days of colonization, of course. And they had a very different idea of cinema, a very different idea of art. As someone immersed in Indian classical music and traditional visual art, Paul was very much interested in interregnums, silent interregnums, uh, sudden breaks and gaps within and permutation combinations in our classical music. Because he was a trained Dhrupadia and he made a film called Dhrupad, perhaps you know. And uh, this insistence on silent interregnums and permutation combinations and going beyond realist representation, becoming anti-representational, holds the key to Call's kind of politics. And I quote from the unpublished paper by Meenak Vishwas. A significant point about politics can be derived from the aesthetic thought of Manikal, whose cinema appears to be apolitical. It is the point about working with absence as yearning. So as I was pondering on this idea of absence and a specific kind of politics that is deceptive, as it says, apparently apolitical, deceptively apolitical. And I was instantly reminded of his sustained engagement with Mohan Rakesh. There are two adaptations. One is, of course, Paul's debut film, Uski Roti, or Our Daily Bread, which is an adaptation of, just a minute, I'll just stop the camera because the connection is a bit unstable. Thank you. So, yeah, his debut film, Uski Roti, is an adaptation of a Mohan Rakesh story. And as you know, Mohan Rakesh, along with Kamleshwar um, and Manu Bhandari, Rajendra Yadav, belong to the group of Nai Kahani writers, the new literature figures in Hindi literary history. But, and Uski Roti has been written on a number of times. Here I want to focus on his second film, the film made after Uski Roti, which is again a Mohan Rakesh adaptation of Rakesh's Ashar Ka Ek Din, One Day in Ashar, or also translated as One Day in the Season of Rain. As you know, Mohan Rakesh sort of, he's regarded as one of the pioneers of Indian theatre movement, new theatre in the 1960s, along with Badal Sarkar and Vijay Tendulkar and Girish Karnad. And Rakesh wrote like 3-4 plays in his brief career before his untimely death. Ashar Ka Ek Din being the first of his plays and the first of its kind in the history of Hindi literature. Sorry. It was published in 1958 and staged in the very same year. It has a very distinctive performance history and a distinctive history of translation. It was a short break, a departure from the existing theatrical traditions in Hindi, the works of, say, Bharatendu Harishchandra and Jaishankar Prasad and others. Because, these figures like Harishchandra and Jaishankar Prasad, they were more interested in a literary dramatic writing and not that much in theatre, in the performative aspects of it and the experimentality of performance. Mohan Rakesh decidedly wanted to depart from that tradition because his forefathers separated drama from theatre. And when he came up with the very first play, Ashar Ka Ek Din, and after that he wrote another play called Laharon Ke Rajhans, both being situated in history. Much later, Rakesh wrote his third play, which is more absurdist, called Aadhe Adhure. And when he was making a trip to Europe, he became acquainted with more experimental European plays such as Peter Handke's Caspar. Perhaps you know about Peter Handke, the writer who won Nobel Prize a few years back, and Caspar being perhaps one of the most experimental works in European theatre after Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot and Endgame. So after getting acquainted with that kind of theatre, Mohan Rakesh came up with more experimental works such as something called Kshatriya, an English play that for Max Muller-Vaughan. Um, the English play was titled Mad Delight, and then he translated it in Hindi called Kshatriya, where the formal influence of Peter Handke's Caspar is visible in it. And he, in some of his interviews, regretted his decision of writing apparently literary plays in the early part of his career. He thought that in his early plays, such as Ashar Ka Ek Din and Laharon Ki Rajhans, these plays have a lot of dialogues, they are very wordy, and this literariness is something that he detested later and wanted to shift to more experimental domains, which didn't happen because of his untimely death. Now, this excessive literariness that Rakesh talks about in an interview with Mohan Maharshi, who directed Ashar Ka Ek Din, my point is this: whether this excessive literariness can be located in the work of Kaul and in the politics of Manikal's adaptation. The play received a lot of criticism from traditional Hindi literary critics, primarily because it is obviously it's on Kalidas, the poet Kalidas's biography, kind of biography, I would say, and the title of the play Ashar Ka Ek Din, of course, refers to the very first few opening slokas in Meghdutam. Sorry. So this is about Kalidas, who deserts his mountainous region, his village, and his beloved, a girl called Mallika in the play, for royal positions in Ujjaini. Mallika becomes a destitute and a prostitute at the end of the play, and Kalidas comes back to her much later, only to find out that the time has changed. The time doesn't wait for anyone. Now, in this apparently quote-unquote historical play, which is very different from other history plays, Mohan Rakesh came up with his own kind of political subtext. For instance, throughout the play, you have this binary between the center and the margin. So from Ujjain, the capital of the Gupta kings, the horsemen and the learned men, they appear in the village to take Kalidas away to the capital. And then in the second act, there are kind of anthropologists, historians sent by the Darbar of the Gupta kings to conduct an ethnographic research on the village where Kalidas used to live, to conduct a research on their kind of dialect and their kind of language. While the village people, so Mallika's mother Ambika, who detests Kalidas, there's a sequence where sounds of horses, approaching horses, can be heard in the background. And Ambika says, whenever these people appear from the capital, they carry some bad news with them. It's an evil omen. That premonition is very much there. And then in the third act, we find out that Kalidas was positioned as the ruler of Kashmir by the Gupta kings, but he has fled due to a revolt that took place in Kashmir. and that overthrew the um, Gupta ruling structure from Kashmir. And Kalidas is traveling around. There's a reason why this 1958 play was, chosen by Manikal for adaptation in 1971, 4 years prior to the emergency, as the, the 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 lack of political stability, violence, uh, fantasy, and the nightmarish days were there in the air. And Cole, in his work, made many interesting choices. For instance, his camera is absolutely static. Those of you who are familiar with Manikal's films, you know about his camera work. Here, it's mostly interior. It is situated within the household where the drama, the apparent quote-unquote drama, takes place with Mallika and her mother. So the other characters like the Rajapurusha, the king's men, the learned men, and Kalidas's relatives, and those historians and ethnographers, they move in and they exit throughout the film as if it's a stage. You have the entry and exit of characters. There's a very specific change of light throughout the film, and K.K. Mahajan, being the cinematographer, does that very well with sudden changes of color and light with his works with the aperture. And throughout Call and K.K. Mahajan, they focus on specific body parts. There are long takes, a very stylized acting. Very often you will find his characters expressionless, which was very common. They just recite the dialogue. So he follows Mohan Rakesh's text very closely, but the characters merely recite the dialogues without so-called theatrical expressions. And you can see the outside world only through the window that opens into the mountains, and the characters are often framed through that window. Time to time, the screen goes completely dark, and the camera remains within the interior except for those phases, those excerpts where it looks outside through the window. There are occasional point of view shots of the mountainous region. And then there are monologues and asides throughout the film. And the voice or the voices sometimes become disembodied. Voices get separated from the bodies that are there within the interior. So you can find the landscape, and then you can hear the disembodied voices on the soundtrack. And there are repetitions very often. I will show you some clips from the film. If you read Mohan Rakesh's text, and there are two translations. One was by Sarah K. Inslee, which, according to those who know better Hindi, it doesn't connote the sense of the subtlety of Mohan Rakesh's language. Later, it has recently been translated by Aparna Dharwadkar, who wrote extensively on Mohan Rakesh in her works on Indian theatre. There you will find a very detailed performance history and a very interesting mode of translation. You will find that in case of Mohan Rakesh's dramatic text, the decor, the mise en scene, extremely detailed. It goes on how the stage will be set. And the most legendary production of that play in 1962, directed by Ibrahim Al-Qazi for the National School of Drama, followed that very closely. Ibrahim Al-Qazi was better known for his extremely spectacular productions. And this performance history is important here. When Paul makes this film, instead of making it detailed, Paul, as I said, Paul comes up with big close-ups of body parts and this sudden lighting changes within the interior. Now I'll show you three clips. One is where uh, you can hear the horses in the background, and Ambika says that there's a premonition of something bad that is going to happen, an impending doom that the horsemen, all the king's men, always come up with. Allow me to share my screen. I hope it's visible. Yes, it is visible.
ये कौन लोग हैं? संभवतः राज्य के कर्मचारी। ये यहाँ क्या कर रहे हैं? जाने क्या कर रहे हैं। कभी वर्षों में ये आकृतियां यहाँ दिखाई देती हैं, और जब भी दिखाई देती है कोई ना कोई अनिष्ट होता है। कभी युद्ध की सूचना आती है, कभी महामारी की। पिछली महामारी में जब तुम्हारे पिता की मृत्यु हुई, तब भी मैंने ये आकृतियां यहाँ देखी।
Now, I'll move to one more sequence where Kalidas talks about how he doesn't want to get detached from the land of his birth and upbringing, the land that kind of inspired him so much, the landscape specifically. And Mallika asks him to leave, to explore new land and the royal court in Ujjain.
मैं तुम्हें घेरना नहीं चाहती, इसीलिए कहती हूँ, जाओ।
तुम पूरी तरह नहीं समझ रही मल्लिका। प्रश्न तुम्हारे घेरने का भी नहीं है। मैं अनुभव करता हूँ कि यह ग्राम प्रांत मेरी वास्तविक भूमि है।
And then two more sequences where you can find Call's camera going out of the chamber, exploring the mountainous region, where you have the disembodied voices of Kalidas and Mallika, voices that are separated from the bodies of them.
तुम्हारी आंखें मेरे अस्थिर मन को और अस्थिर कर देंगी। मैं इसे बचना चाहता था। मैं जानता था तुम पर उसकी क्या प्रतिक्रिया होगी, दूसरे तुमसे क्या कहेंगे। फिर भी इस संबंध में निश्चित था कि तुम्हारे मन में कोई वैसा भाव नहीं आएगा, और मैं आशा लिए हुए चला गया कि एक कल ऐसा आएगा जब मैं तुमसे ये सब कह सकूंगा और तुम्हें अपने मन के द्वंद्व का विश्वास दिला सकूंगा। यह नहीं सोचा कि द्वंद्व एक ही व्यक्ति तक सीमित नहीं होता, परिवर्तन एक ही दिशा को व्याप्त नहीं करता। इसलिए आज यहाँ आकर बहुत व्यर्थता का बोध हो रहा है। लोग सोचते हैं मैंने उस जीवन और वातावरण में रहकर बहुत कुछ लिखा है, परंतु मैं जानता हूं कि मैंने वहां रहकर कुछ नहीं लिखा। जो कुछ लिखा है वो यहाँ के जीवन का ही संचय था। कुमार संभव की पृष्ठभूमि यह है, और तपस्वी मैं तुम हो। मेघदूत के यक्ष की पीड़ा मेरी पीड़ा है, और विरह विमर्दता यक्षिणी तुम हो। यद्यपि मैंने स्वयं यहाँ होने और तुम्हें नगर में देखने की कल्पना की, अभिज्ञान शकुंतल में शकुंतला के रूप में तुम ही मेरे सामने थी। मैंने जब जब लिखने का प्रयत्न किया, तुम्हारे और अपने जीवन के इतिहास को फिर फिर दोहराया, और जब उससे हटकर लिखना चाहा, रचना प्राणवान नहीं हुई। रघुवंश में आज कविला भी मेरी ही वेदना की अभिव्यक्ति।
And the last part of it, where Kalidas acknowledges the change of time, again in a disembodied voice. So the screen goes dark, as I'm saying, it happens so many times in this film. And then
क्या सोच रहे हो?
सोच रहा हूं कि वह आषाढ़ का ऐसा ही दिन था, ऐसे ही घाटी में मेघ भरे थे और असमय अंधेरा हो आया था। मैंने घाटी में एक आहत हरिण शावक को देखा था और उठाकर यहाँ आया था। तुमने उसका उपचार किया था।
और भी तो कुछ सोच रहे हो?
और सोच रहा हूं कि उपत्यकाओं का विस्तार वही है, पर्वत से आने वाला मार्ग वही है, वायु में वैसी ही नमी है, वातावरण की ध्वनियां भी वैसी ही हैं। और कि वही चेतना है जिसमें कंपन होता है, वही हृदय है जिसमें आवेश जागता है। परंतु परंतु यह कोरे पृष्ठों का महाकाव्य तब नहीं लिखा गया था।
तुम कह रहे थे कि तुम फिर से आरंभ करना चाहते हो।
मैंने कहा था, मैं आज से आरंभ करना चाहता हूँ। यह संभवतः इच्छा का द्वंद्व था, परंतु देख रहा हूँ कि समय अधिक शक्तिशाली है, क्योंकि
क्योंकि
क्योंकि वह प्रतीक्षा नहीं करता।
just a minute. So in this case, as you can see, Call, apart from this profound engagement with Rakesh's text in greater detail, that talks about throughout the text, you'll find the center margin binary, the capital, and its marauding troops that come to the margin, the village, and the premonition, the sense of doom, and the ethnographic interest of the man of the capital. And then, of course, this revolt in Kashmir. Incidentally, Call made a film, a very interesting non-fictional film on Kashmir many years later. It's called Before My Eyes. It's on YouTube. You may watch it. Made in 1988, just a few years before the militancy started there. But within this space, what is happening, apart from Call's engagement with this apparently a political play that is situated in distant history, there's a sense of the transformative, and there's a sense of the interior. Call's camera never leaves the interior and de-dramatizes the theater here. Perhaps, as I was reminded of a French theorist, film theorist, Jean-Louis Schaeffer, would have wanted to comment on this interiority, because in his very well-known book, which has recently been translated from French, The Ordinary Man of Cinema, Jean-Louis Schaeffer wrote that cinema itself has an interior history. Cinema exists within us as a kind of ultimate chamber, and I quote from Schaeffer, where the hope and ghost of an interior history circulate. This invisible chamber inside us, where in the absence of any object, we torture the human race itself, and from which, mysteriously, incomprehensibly, the feeling or conscious anticipation of the sublime comes to us, unquote. that interior history, which, according to Schaeffer, is cinema itself, can be located through the camera work of Cole and his engagement with the play, that transforms our expectation for immediate politics in the 1970s into an aesthetic experience. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Parichay, for a very illuminating talk. So I would now invite questions from those in the audience who are watching. So please feel free to post your questions in the chat on YouTube. Would that be all right, Parichay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
So they will write their questions and comments in the YouTube chat box, and that will appear directly inside the virtual studio.
Excellent.
Parichay, take yourself off from the so that we can see them.
Can you see me?
Yes.
I'm just asking you to take yourself off the solo layout so that we can
Okay.
see Kaamya.
Sorry about that.
Well, perhaps I could start with a question.
Please do, Kaamya. Thank you.
Yes. So I found your talk very fascinating in many respects, but the question I'm about to ask might take us on a tangent, but I will ask it nevertheless. The 70s also witnessed the rise of a certain kind of transnational feminist movement, which was very specifically focused, on issues of equal pay, of sexual discrimination, addressing sexual assault. India, I think the Indian state was also kind of grappling with many of its failures in especially in not securing the promises of independence for women. The Towards Equality report was published, I think, in 1976. So what I found interesting about your talk, especially, was your focus on the not so literal representations of political movements. So in that sense, could I ask you to comment on gender and on the not so political representations of feminist movements in cinema in this time?
Thanks, Kaamya, for that question. So, as in this particular play, there's a very specific gender politics involved. The woman who is left behind, and she quote unquote degenerates into prostitution, and Kalidas comes back, and Kalidas, as he's talking about their bygone days, he's startled by the child, the quote unquote illegitimate child that cries from the interior. So, and when Aparna Dharwadkar translated the play very recently, in her introduction, she wrote on the gender politics. At the same time, as we are talking about the 1970s, and I'm talking about the theater cinema collaboration, in the long 1960s theater, there are specific plays that talk extensively about the gender politics and sexuality and sexual subversion in many aspects of the term. For instance, the works of Maheshwar Kunchwar. I referred to Maheshwar Kunchwar, and some of his plays were adapted by Ketan Mehta and Govind Nihalni. Of course, Vijay Tendulkar. Cole adapted a Vijay Tendulkar text much later in his career with K. Hariharan as a part of a film collective. They adapted Ghasiram Kotwal. That was definitely very, very prevalent. And Cole, in his own career, some of his texts are definitely very interesting in terms of gender. For instance, Dubidha, the adaptation of the Vijay Dandetha story, which is shot near Jodhpur. And also, I'd say Siddheshwari, the quote unquote biofilm on the great Thundi singer Siddheshwari. So yes, the gender politics was definitely very important, but it depends on in case of Shahani, I refer to Shahani's Tarang made in 1984, where Smita Patil plays the widow of a murdered labor union worker, murdered labor leader. unionist, and she is sexually exploited by the factory owner, Amul Palekar, and that becomes a very interesting pivotal point in the text, in Shahani's way of looking at the labor history of the city of Bombay after the emergency. So yes, gender politics is definitely very important. I didn't focus that much on gender politics in my presentation because I wanted to focus more on other aspects of Kaul's politics, Kaul and Rakesh's politics. So gender can definitely be emphasized on, but that would take me to a different direction. So here, at least in this context, I restricted myself to a few other things. So there's another question. I mean, does that answer your question, Kaamya? Hello.
Yes. Thank you very much,
So
Parichay.
there's another question.
We have a question from
Yes.
Sanjay. Yes.
Sanjay, the term.
So Sanjay's question.
Yes. So this is as I can see, the criticism of politics and ideology in cinema moves from textual analysis to another dimension. Is this ambiguity ambiguous in cinema? Sanjay, I can share that Hoyling Law book with you. It's a very recent work on ambiguity and film criticism. You'll find out how ambiguity is a very contested term in the domain of cinema. Ambiguity may mean many things. The idea of the ambiguous in a film, it may mean the structure of the film. It's a puzzle like, say, Mulholland Drive. But when it comes to the domain of film criticism, ambiguity has a very specific purpose. So, for instance, for literary studies scholars, they know about the function of ambiguity, right? That there's this very famous text of 7 types of ambiguity, right, in literary theory. In case of film criticism, this idea of ambiguity and ambiguous has a very distinctive, critical reason for addressing the ambiguous in cinema, and an aesthetic reason, to be honest. So what I wanted to do here is I wanted to focus on the idea of the political and political in cinema, or cinematic political thinking, as something that is ambiguous, something that is a displacement that gets displaced consistently, and something that can be explained only through our exploration of the idea of ambiguity itself in film criticism, most importantly. So Bhairav Barman has made some comments. These are not questions. So counterfactual history, yeah, I can just give an example. For instance, a talk that I haven't heard, but I read about it. It's by Indibar Kamtekar, the historian who teaches in JNU. He made a presentation in IIT Mandi, which was about what would have happened if the Japanese conquered India during the Second World War. So he unearthed a lot of archival. Yes.
Audible. You're not audible.
Can you hear me now?
It is okay now.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. So yeah. So counterfactual history. It's a very interesting thing for me, and I can give an example of a talk that I haven't heard, but I heard things about the talk. I hope you can hear me. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So I'm referring to a talk by Professor Indivar Kamtekar, historian who teaches in JNU. He delivered a talk in IIT Mandi, HSS department, which was about, I read about the talk on their website and I know about Kamtekar's works. It was about what would have happened if the Japanese conquered India during the Second Great War. So he unearthed a lot of archival materials on the premonition, the impending doom in the then newspapers and other documents, and creates a very different way of looking at history. It's a kind of counterfactual thing. Obviously, the Japanese couldn't, but what would have happened if they did, and how that premonition influenced Indian media and public opinion and public sphere of that particular time. This is just an example. So I just wanted to talk about a film here, which was made 4 years prior to the emergency, but has a very specific political subtext in terms of quote unquote the usual politics and also in terms of its aesthetic experience. Okay. Okay.
Parichay,
Firstly,
could you read out Vairab's comments before you proceed, if that's all right?
yeah, thank you. Thank you, Kaamya. So the first one is the idea of cinema as mere language as opposed to make split some more sentences. And the second one is the idea of convergence in art, more sentences. So the first thing I said, while I was talking about reading of Gilles Deleuze, both of them, let me stop my camera. This is still. So both of them opposed the idea of cinema as language. And here, Bhairav, you were referring to Krista Metz and his way of looking at cinema as language. But these are different theoretical schools, of course. So, the difference or the opposition to Krista Metz is not really significant here. I'm just interested in the way Cole read Deleuze and talked about this well-known idea, well-known rather idea of cinema as language that can be opposed, and elements of cinema that cannot be compared to elements of language utterances. And the next question, the idea of convergence in art, of course, it refers to perspective painting, the perspective European equivalent in the European Renaissance, and that was imposed on the Indian art scene by the British. So if you read some art history from that period, you'll find out that there are works by Patra and others. You'll find out how the British Raj established 4 schools in undivided India, and through their pedagogy, they imposed the realist perspective painting model. But Indian traditional art was very different, right? Our miniature art, Mughal art, Kangra art, Pahari art was definitely very different and very anti-realist. In general, Oriental art has been anti-realist, not conforming to that European Renaissance perspective model. Cole was very much interested in exploring that aspect of Indian art. And if you watch Siddheshwari, you will find spaces where Cole inserts miniature paintings within his frames. So this idea of going against the convergence in art, where 2 lines converge and the bigger things appear in front and things recede distance. So that perspective model, that window-like framing, was opposed by Cole and Shahani because of their anti-realist standpoint. That's the basic thing about it. Any other question? So far, these are the questions that we got. Let me start the camera again. I'm sorry about this, this on and off mode due to this.
Well, but as a host, probably it's not my place to ask a question as such, because
Please
it's kind
do.
of. But I mean, and to be very frank, I mean, I could have done this otherwise as well. But since there is an audience, I would probably ask this very fundamental thing about this is, so basically, being as kind of a film scholar, I mean, part-time film scholar, I mean, of course, anybody would be noticing. Anybody with a slight amount of knowledge in films and some sort of a viewing history would be acknowledging that there is certainly a very large difference between based on emergency. I'm talking about emergency, especially the 70s, 75 to 77, or maybe the long 70s as well. There are almost 2 different camps. So on one side, we have films like Ritwik Ghatak, Satyajit Ray, Mrinal Sen. I'm not actually equating their stance on films, but on a very large perspective, we see commonalities, stylistic, thematic commonalities between the 3. On the other hand, a radical difference, as you just have said, let's talk even about Money Call. It's a completely different approach towards cinema as such. Everything from the dialogue to the actors to the acting to basically everything is radically different. Although they are, at least their claim is, to be making extremely political films exactly the way Satyajit Ray or Mrinal Sen or Ritwik Ghatak wanted to make one. So I understand why that is. Of course, there is this whole question of interiority. There is this whole question of let's say a dogmatic persuasion of art on Kaul's part and all that. But my question, Parichay, is that how exactly Manikaul is bringing out politics through his films? Because I mean, bringing out the question of bringing out politics through Ritwik Ghatak or Mrinal Sen is not exactly a very tough puzzle. We all can see that. We all can see the way it is edited, the way it is shot, and all that. How is Kaul dealing with this matter?
I would answer with an anecdote, Deepu. So, Kaul Siddheshwari was rejected by IFI, International Film Festival of India, and its jury board, which was mostly constituted by middle cinema filmmakers like Ketan Mehta and others, if I remember them correctly. So Kaul said after that in an interview that I have been able to read in the archives of National Film Archive of India, Pune. Kaul said that they would have wanted something like Lust for Life, a more specific run-of-the-mill biofilm. They expected something like a biofilm from me. And Kaul made a very vitriolic remark that firstly, these middle cinema people, they're neither here nor there. And secondly, they would have rejected Tarkovsky's Andrei Rublev because it's not historically true. So there's an obvious, not so obvious rather, way of looking at the festival politics, cinematic political thinking of the time, and Kaul and Shahani dissociated themselves from that mode of politics. That's why, as I referred to Shahani when I interviewed him, and this is the specific question that I asked him, that there's an objection leveled against your cinema that is not distinctively political. So he said, my politics is Kosambian. I'm more interested in that exploration of mythology from a Marxist perspective. So this is definitely, so they're engaging with their contemporary politics. That's why I chose this film, which was made, as I said, 4 years before Emergency. And there's a reason why Kaul is choosing this particular text, which was written back in 1958, and not a more explicit, sexually, politically subversive text by some other playwright like Maheshal Kunchuar or Vijay Tendulkar. Instead, he's looking at this particular text, which is apparently written many years back and situated in terms of its narrative in distant history. And then he does his trick. So I just wanted to read Rakesh and Kaul side by side, not in terms of adaptation, definitely not. Adaptation is not the question I'm interested in, not the issue I'm interested in. I'm more interested into the politics of language in Rakesh, the politics of the center margin binary, that reference to that's very pertinent reference to Kashmir and its revolt in Rakesh, and what with it, his politics of interiority and this transformative quality of his political thinking.
I don't want to prolong it, Parichay. I would just stop in here, but just one single query. What sort of audience did Kaul or Sahani have in mind? That question cannot arise in the sense of Mrinal Sen or Ritwik Ghatak. Of course, they wanted to reach to the mass. They employed melodrama up to a very large extent. And Satyajit Ray also, with his bourgeois background and everything, he found an audience, and probably that's the audience he tried to reach. What about Kaul and Sahani?
Sorry. Of course, Kaul and Shahani didn't find any audience for a really long time. Most of Kaul's films are not even released. I mean, many of his films are not, like Uski Roti was not released. Now, I mean, when Dhaksha organizes exhibitions on Manikaul, he always finds a very different and distinctive space for that. He organizes screenings of Manikaul in art gallery, within the space of the art gallery, where you have a very different audience. And Kaul himself made a very sarcastic remark on this. I think his were televised, first on Doordarshan, in the same slot where they used to show popular Hindi films like Raj Kapoor's Bobby and other stuff. So Kaul came up with a very sardonic remark, I would say. Kaul said, do you screen or project Indian classical, Hindustani classical performances in the same slot with Bombay film music, you don't. You have a specific slot for Shastriya Sangeet. And my cinema is a Shastriya cinema that requires a very different slot.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. That sums it up, I guess. Yeah.
So,
That's a
Kaamya, as chair, you have to conclude the session.
And I think that's a nice note to conclude this session. Thanks so much, Parichay, again. That was a fantastic talk, and I think we had a very lively Q&A. Thanks for inviting me to be the chair on this session. And for those viewing, please do tune in for the remaining 2 sessions of the workshop. And that's it for now.
Thank you all. Please be back for Amrit Gangar's at 3 p.m. Thank you, Kaamya. Thank you, Dibbo.